Hello, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Karen Bassrab, and I'm with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in the Food Policy Networks Project. And we're just here today to provide kind of a container and some questions to guide conversation. But we're really looking to this to be a conversation, providing a space for you all to share with one another and talk through some of the challenges and solutions that you found around lobbying and advocacy. So we invited councils that have some relationship with government, whether you're embedded in a government organization, whether you're created by legislation by a government, whether you have members that are part of government, to talk about the parameters and boundaries that you've run into related to your work advocating for or lobbying for food systems policy change. And so we know that councils work across varying scales from local, state to federal. And so there's a very real chance that you've run across some challenges or barriers. And so we wanted to hear a little bit about what are those challenges you're running into, and a little bit about kind of what have you tried, what works, to talk about what is the difference between advocacy and lobbying. But before we get started, just to kind of check in with the room about who's here, we wanted to do a couple of polls. And these polls are asking a little bit about your council's relationship to government. So the first question is, what is your Food Policies Council's relationship with government? And you can select all that apply. Is your FPC recognized as an official advisory body to local or state government? Was your FPC created through legislation? Is your FPC a project or program of a government agency? Does your FPC receive funding from the local or state government? Are government employees or elected representatives members of your FPC? Does your our government staff, do they serve as liaisons or coordinators for the FPC, or none of the above? And then the second question is, has your FPC ever been told it could not take action because the action is considered lobbying, or because the government is not allowed to advocate on issues? The answers are yes, no, or don't know. So I'll allow everyone a few more minutes to answer the questions. More seconds. Thank you for taking a moment to answer those questions. So it looks like about 50% of councils are recognized as an advisory body to their local government. Another 43% have a staff member that's a liaison or coordinator. 40% have some representation from government as members. And then it's kind of split 30 between created through legislation, a project of a government agency, or the FPC receives funding. Great. And about 23 of you have been told you couldn't take action, so about a fourth, and a third said no, and then the rest of you said don't know. Great. This just helps us get a kind of sense of kind of who's in the room and what we'll be talking about. So today, the agenda for today is that we will, we're going to start with, we have Carrie Murphy here, who's from Salem, Massachusetts with the Board of Health. And she's the one that brought this idea for this conversation to us because she was running into some challenges in terms of the work that their council does around advocacy. So I'm going to let her share her story of kind of the questions that are coming up around the work that she does. And then we also have Eileen Horn with us, who was a former state legislator in Kansas, and has worked with the Kansas Action Network with their food policy councils to talk about kind of what is the difference between advocacy and lobbying, to give us some grounding. And then after that, we'll go into breakout rooms. And in these small breakout rooms, we're going to put you into groups of about 5 or 6 people and just have you talk about your food policy council's experience with local government trying to advocate or lobbying. Have you experienced any pushback because an action was considered unallowable, or how has your FPC tried to address that action? And then after that, we'll all come back together and kind of share what are the solutions, what are things you have tried, what has been successful in kind of communicating to a government agency that an action around changing food systems policy is allowable and it's not necessarily just lobbying. So that's kind of the overall framework for today. And we hope that you will chime in the chat, unmute yourselves and join in the conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to share a little bit about her experience to get us started.
Thank you, Karen. As Karen said, my name is Carrie Murphy, and I'm from Salem, Massachusetts. I work in city government. I am the health and wellness coordinator for the city of Salem. I work out of the health department, but I staff Salem's Food Policy Council, Salem Food for All. The Food Policy Council started back in 2016 as an independent coalition, but just last year at the end of 2022, we transitioned to become a municipal food policy council. So we're now an advisory council to the mayor. Not long after our transition, our mayor was elected to be lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. So we were faced with having to have a special election because it was in the middle of her term, which happened just earlier this spring. So we thought this would be a great way to have the Food Policy Council get involved and raise our profile by asking each mayoral candidate questions about how they would support the food system work that was already happening in Salem, how they would work to improve food access and reduce food insecurity if they were elected. I'm a city employee and I do regular ethics and conflict of interest training. And so I felt like I had a pretty good handle on what was allowed and what was not. And I reviewed our state ethics regulations about what a public body could and couldn't do. And as I was reviewing it, really the only examples they gave for prohibited activities were when public bodies directly campaigned for candidates, like had fundraising activities on behalf of the public body, distribute campaign literature on letterhead, or basically anything related to influencing how residents would vote. So we thought, based on the fact that we were providing the same exact questions to each candidate as a way to educate residents on where each candidate stood on food access, that would be okay. But where we ran into trouble was that only one candidate answered our questions and we weren't really sure what to do. So I reached out to our city solicitor, who immediately said, you're violating state ethics laws. This is campaigning. You need to cease and desist what it is you're doing. And so I kind of questioned it. I said, well, if we're not just advocating for one candidate and just presenting this to both, we thought that this would, be okay. And she thought about it and she decided she wasn't so sure. So she contacted the State Ethics Commission. And I did as well, just to get some guidance, because I was surprised that doing that would be an issue. And even they weren't so sure as I was talking to them, and they actually made it a topic for their weekly meeting, but did eventually come back to both of us saying that that was considered a political activity, so it was not allowed. So I reached out to Brittany Peets from the Mass Food System Collaborative to find out if she had run into this in her relationships with other food policy councils in the state. And then she reached out to Karen, who thought this might be a good idea for a webinar. And here we are. I'm really excited to hear from other food policy councils on how they navigate, the challenges of working within state regulations and still able to do advocacy and policy work, and to share some best practices here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for sharing your story. Just so that everyone's aware, there were about 115 people that registered for their conversation. So this topic hit a nerve very much with councils. So we're going to record it so that people can hear a little bit about some of the conversations that we're having and possible solutions as well, since a lot of them couldn't join us. But to help us kind of tease out a little bit of the difference between advocacy and lobbying, I'm going to ask Eileen Horn, with her experience in Kansas and her knowledge as a former state legislator, to kind of set the framing in terms of what is the difference between advocacy and lobbying.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And Carrie, thanks for your story. Sounds really familiar. Ran into a very similar situation when I was on the Douglas County Food Policy Council. So I'm a consultant with the Kansas Food Action Network. We're a network of about 25 food policy councils in the state of Kansas. I helped found the Douglas County Food Policy Council, which was the first in the state and the longest running. And so I have run into this particular challenge several times. And as Karen said, then I also served in the Kansas State Legislature for 2 terms. And so I kind of got to see it from the other side and be on the receiving end of lobbying and advocacy activities. So what I'm sharing today are some slides that we prepared at the Kansas Food Action Network for our councils. We have an annual advocacy day where our council members can come to the Capitol in Topeka and talk to state legislators about issues in the food system that matter to them in their communities. And because many of our food policy councils, actually most in Kansas, are organized governmentally. So they are appointed advisory boards appointed by their city or their county. And a lot of times they are staffed by health department employees, parks and rec employees, city management office employees, folks who are understandably wary of running afoul of any of these regulations. And so we've done a lot of work with our councils to kind of help educate and reassure them about what are the lines of what's appropriate and what's going to get you in trouble. So I share this slide in that training to just, kind of make sure everyone's on the same page with these terms. So advocacy is really a wide range of activities. And the idea is you're trying to influence something around you. Usually it's policy in the case of food policy councils. And what that can look like is like educating the public on the potential effects of a policy, but you're not encouraging people to take a position, but you're saying this is the impact of what that could be. You can also, be broadly asking for more political attention on a social issue. And it can go as far as meeting with an elected official to educate them generally about an issue. So if you sit down with your mayor and you bring your council's food system plan and you say, this is the plan that we're interested in supporting and that we just wrote as a food policy council, that's purely educational. And I think is really good practice for food policy councils. Lobbying, on the other hand, is kind of a subset of advocacy. And the idea is with lobbying, you are trying to influence government officials and trying to influence them and have them make a decision that you want them to make. So these are usually more specific and more targeted. So examples could be releasing a report that explains why a legislator should vote for a particular bill. And this is really important. It has to do with the specificity. You're specifically saying House Bill 275, and you're specifically saying that it should be voted for or against. Another way that lobbying takes place often are these kind of mass action alert emails that get sent to a listserv, and they ask the subscriber to contact their legislator and encourage them to vote in a certain way. And then another activity that's pretty common is calling, visiting, emailing legislators and asking them to vote in a particular way. The key thing here is that you are trying to influence a decision and you are in the audience that you're focused on is that elected official. So here's some more examples of what that might look like. So advocacy, let's say you sit down with the mayor, you sit down with your state representative, and you can say something like, eliminating the state sales tax on food helps all of us, but especially, low-income families and rural grocers. That's a fact. You can share it. You can also email your food policy council, and you can say, the bill that would lower the state sales tax on food was introduced today in House Tax Committee, and you can provide the link, like you can track the progress here, but you're not saying anything more than, these are educational, right? Informational only, no call to action. Examples of lobbying would be if you sit down with a legislator and say, please vote yes on Senate Bill 248, which would eliminate the state sales tax on food. And what's important there is your audience is a legislator, so someone who can make decisions and set policy, and that you've specifically said, do a thing. Also, if you email your food policy council and you're saying, and it's like a call to action, like, hey, everybody, email your legislator today and ask them to vote yes on Senate Bill 248, that would be a lobbying activity, because you're, again, specifically directing it at that audience with a specific action. And that, depending on the structure of your food policy council, lobbying may not be a problem for you, because if you're organized outside of government and you're a nonprofit, nonprofits have the ability to lobby. I believe it's up to 20% of their budget even can be spent on lobbying. Someone should fact check me on that. But there is some room for nonprofit organizations for sure, and all of us as individuals to do these activities. But where it gets tricky, as Carrie was sharing, is when you are a government appointed advisory board, and so you have some restrictions on you. This is what we tell our councils, is that you're probably going to face some restrictions on your lobbying due to either your nonprofit status or your connection to government. So you should understand what that is. Those of you who are organized in government, Carrie was super proactive. I would suggest doing the same thing, like reach out to your city attorney and find out what you can do and ask ahead of time, because then you can understand what the parameters are. But what's totally appropriate is a food policy council can provide issue briefs, can create reports that provide information. And if you give that to one of your partner organizations and they run with it and lobby, that's fine. That's them doing it, right? So a lot of food policy councils kind of stay in that lane of creating information and creating reports and issue briefs. But also all of us as individuals are allowed to make our voice heard. We all can reach out to our elected officials and take positions and ask them to take certain actions. So if you have restrictions in terms of your position on a council, you can still do this as an individual. I would just caution that you make sure it always comes from like your personal email, and that you don't say anything like, on behalf of the food policy council that I serve on, because you're just like representing yourself as an individual. So if you're a farmer and you sit on food policy council and you want to weigh in on something happening in the ag committee, just make sure you make it clear in your email that like, this is me as a farmer telling you what I think. And that should be enough to kind of keep you clear of any of these challenges. But there's a big caveat here, which is you might be totally following this to the letter of the law, and there could still be a perception, right? The mayor still might be like, I really don't like how my food policy council is getting out in front of me on this. Or a legislator might be really annoyed because they don't agree with your position, and they start digging into like, who is this food policy council? And, wait a minute, they're not supposed to, advocate or whatever. So you might still be, in the clear, but I think a lot of this is just that nuance of maybe understanding your community and recognizing that, a legislator or elected official still might take issue with how active you all are being on a particular topic. So I know that was kind of a lot, but that's how we've talked about it in Kansas, and that's how we've kind of helped our council members navigate these discussions. But honestly, sometimes our health department employees say, I just can't even go to Topeka, right? I can't even go to the Capitol. It'll look bad. I'll get in trouble. And then some people say, you know what? I'm going to take the day off. I'm going to be my person. I'm going to be my own self, right? I'm not going to wear my health department tag. I'm just going to be an individual. And that's how they navigate that. But it's definitely not easy, which is why I think so many people signed up for this webinar. So I'll get back to you, Karen.
Thank you. Eileen, there were two questions in the chat for you. Do you mind if?
Yeah.
One of them says, just want to clarify, what about if you're encouraging folks to tell their elected officials how to feel about a specific bill and what a bill would do without encouraging residents to say anything specific, so like a yes or no on the bill?
Yeah, as long as the line for lobbying is really, you have to have an ask. So your audience has to be that elected official, and you have to say, please vote yes, please vote no. And I I wouldn't get like too close to that line, you know, like I wouldn't, I think everything you could do if you present it in terms of fact sheets and you can say like the impact of this bill on our farmers is going to be this, that's purely educational and you should be good.
And then there was a follow-up to that, which said, so along those lines, even if you tell your supporters to say yes or no, they're lobbying and not you, right?
That's true. What I would be cautious of is if you're a leader of a food policy council that's within government, I would not send an email to your list of supporters with direct lobbying action. I think that'll come back on you in a bad way. But if you as the food policy council shine a light on something and say, this, you know, House Bill 275 is going to be really terrible for our farmers, and here are the bullet points as to why, and you put that on social media and you put it on your website and you inform your stakeholders, if they run with it and go lobby, that's them doing it individually. But I wouldn't send an action alert from your food policy council.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there was one more question for you, and that's, would you mind sharing your slides, the slides with everyone?
Sure, I'll send it out as a PDF. I'll send it to you, Karen, you can distribute it.
Thank you. And then for those that aren't aware, we put out a guide in 2019 on advocacy and lobbying 101 for food policy councils. That's in our database as well. That also talks through some of the nuances. And this was created by the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic and their students. So there's another resource for you as well. So with that, we're going to, what we'd like to do right now is break everyone up into kind of small groups to have for about 15 minutes to talk through kind of when your food policy council has encountered experienced pushback from your local or state government on an action because it was considered an unallowable advocacy action, and how your food policy council addressed that pushback. And so what we're asking you to do is to take a moment and say, you know, to answer the question, why were you told that you couldn't take action? What about the action was considered inappropriate? And also, what did your food policy council do to address the local or state government's concerns about the FPC's action? At this point, we're going to kind of open it up. I just wanted to take a moment to see from your conversations in your small groups, were there any similarities or common barriers or common themes that were coming up in terms of what you were encountering in terms of pushback or government not allowing any advocacy actions? Did you find any similarities in your conversations? Go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I think one thing we're all kind of in the same position as advisory councils, and really just getting through the red tape of having to go through so many channels to get permission to do the things, and, you know, getting okayed by the mayor. It was asked if we could write op-eds for our local papers in order to get our viewpoints across. And a couple of people in our group said they were not allowed to do that. You know, had to go through the communications department, and there's just so many layers that it makes it challenging.
Ome Salama. Sorry if I mispronounced that.
No problem. I just go by Ome. So our group, the one similar, like more than half the group were all new, so they were learning. From the 3 people that had done it before, 2 things were similar. We both had done like candidate forums, and it was fine. But one of the food policy councils, that's the South Coast Food Policy Council, is actually a nonprofit. They're not appointed by government, but we are appointed by government, and we had a fine time doing a forum. The other thing we had in like similar was that we had signed on to like a sign-on letter, and we kind of wanted to ask the group, or maybe Eileen in specific, if that is a no-no, because after what you said, I'm kind of like, ooh, maybe we shouldn't have signed this letter. And the sign-on letter that, and whoever else was in my group, I can't remember who did a sign-on letter as well. The one that we signed on to was the GASNIP incentive programs request to strengthen the program in the farm bill. So it wasn't like a specific bill, like there's no marker bill for this. It was just a general like invest in GusNip and, you know, make sure there's no match requirement, like so it's on the federal level, but it's addressed specifically to members of the agriculture subcommittee or the committee, the agriculture committee. So I wonder if that is considered lobbying and that the council shouldn't be doing, like, you know, signing on behalf of the Columbia Food Policy Committee. And who else was it in our group that did a similar thing? Can't remember who.
Oh, that was our commission. It was a couple of months ago. It was a letter related to the state budget. So in New York State, when they were looking at the budget and having those conversations, there was a letter from, oh my gosh, a hunger relief organization in New York. And that was shared with me. I brought it to our commission and said, hey, you have expressed an interest in these things. I am just sharing with you this opportunity. This is how you may be involved if you would like this opportunity. And they ultimately voted to sign on to it. And it sounds like, I mean, that would be pretty direct lobbying because it was very specific to the budget. No one yelled at us, but it's out there and maybe we shouldn't have done it. That's why we had questions about it too.
So I don't know that I have like the definitive answer on sign-on letters. I think I saw Mary Morrow on here, who's an attorney. Oh, I don't think she's on anymore. So if anybody knows for sure, please jump in. I would say that probably what we talked about was that, you know, if you're a city or county advisory board, invite your city or county attorney in probably annually, just to like, because you're going to have new members, you're going to have turnover, and have them like review the Open Meetings Act or the Open Records Act or all the things that you're subject to. And then that's a time to ask them these kind of questions, you know, like, we want to do this, but we're not sure if we can. So that you're kind of, you know, on the record asking, asking for permission before you get in trouble.
There's a couple of comments in the chat related to sign-on letters as well from Grace, who says that our Food Policy Council specifically, we wouldn't be allowed to sign on to a letter directed to another government body because we only can make recommendations to the mayor and city council. And then from Washtenaw County Food Policy Council, they can sign on to letters, but need to get approval from Corporation Council with the county first, because we're a subcommittee of the County Board of Commissioners. Grace or Markle, do you want to add anything to your comments?
Not really. It's just pretty basic for us in Minneapolis, is that like we've been told that our purpose is to make recommendations to the mayor and city council. So we're not really supposed to make recommendations to other bodies. You know, we could recommend the mayor and city council support a state policy or something if we want to get around it, or we can, you know, share information about things, but we're not writing letters to anyone except for the mayor and city council and the park board.
And for Washtenaw County, I just clarified it's in Michigan. Our county seat is in Ann Arbor. We have a County Board of Commissioners approved policy agenda. So if we are providing a letter of support that's in alignment with one of our policy priorities, we usually have a green light to do that. When it comes to lobbying activities, we can do that, but we have to coordinate and get approval from the county first. And so depending on the activity, it either needs to be Corporation Council. If we're trying to get our County Board of Commissioners to take action, they of course have to pass a resolution and vote to take that action. We can't tell them to do anything. So it kind of depends on what's happening. But if we're just submitting a letter of support of a concept, and that aligns with something that's on our board approved policy agenda, then we've got that green light kind of baked into how that works.
I really want to elevate that as a really great strategy. So usually that process starts a couple months before the legislative session. So if you know your council, let's say it's a county council and it wants to weigh in on a state policy, then work with your county manager and your county commissioners on that policy agenda so that you get something in there that says, our county would support elimination of the statewide sales tax on food. And then it's in there, so you're covered. And so to your point, exactly, because legislation moves so fast that if you have to wait for approval to send a letter, that bill's going to have passed. I mean, you guys know how it goes. So like something to cover yourself early is like before the session heats up is a really good idea.
Eileen, do you remember here in Kansas, whenever you made the special point that it does the tax, the food sales tax is not going to affect Erie County, it's a statewide change. So you remember we made sure we let them know that before we decided to take any action on it.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. That was a policy that was a state level policy to eliminate the state sales tax on food. But all of our local government organized councils were concerned that their county commissioners or city councils weren't going to support it because it could also impact locals who levy a sales tax on food. So we had to, you're right, and we had to be really clear. We're just talking about the state sales tax portion. Yeah, because councils were worried about getting in trouble.
I want to just add, and I don't know where this fits into this conversation, but I kind of feel that the Food Policy Council would have an opinion that the city would never sign on to. Like our mayor's pretty conservative, our state is super, super red, and little Columbia City Food Policy Council members are this like beacon of a bit more progressiveness. So there's no way that we would be able to have an opinion on like a state policy and then convince our city to take that same position. It would really have to come just from the Food Policy Council. Does that make sense? Like, I can't imagine the city kind of signing, so, and that's again, something we would need to ask council. Like if we just as the Food Policy Council could like do a sign on letter, on any level of government, be it state or federal county, but I can't imagine we'd ever do that. But yeah, just a bit of a caveat, like the Food Policy Councils often, even in red states, tend to be a bit more, progressive for lack of a better word. And so you wouldn't get the whole county or the whole city's buy-in on a particular, policy that you're weighing in on.
I'm curious if there are any councils that are on this call that exist in a dynamic where the council's agenda might not align with their city or state agenda, and how, if you've been successful at getting the city or your state government to support the agenda items of the council.
I don't know if my name's Amanda. I'm with Oakland County in Michigan, and I see Kisa, one of our colleagues. I don't know if she's still on, but I know there's been one of the other counties on the west side of the state has had issues with this, and in regards specifically even with using the terms and concepts of equity. And so they've really been, I don't know if Kisa's on, if they've come through anything, but I know it is happening.
Thanks, Amanda. Kisa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I believe that's Ottawa County. Like when you look at the state of Michigan, the west side is pretty conservative. So that would be like Ottawa County. They're going through a lot, especially even with dismantling all of the DE&I offices within that state. So I'm pretty sure that the FPC has to follow some very strict restrictions.
Thank you. So we're kind of already headed in that direction, but we wanted to spend the last 20 minutes of this conversation talking about what's working. What strategies or actions has your Food Policy Council taken to address local or state government concerns around advocacy and lobbying? What have you tried? What's worked? Or maybe what have you tried and thought would work and didn't work? But how are you trying to circumvent some of the concerns or challenges that are being put forward by your local government in terms of the role of councils and advocating and lobbying? Go ahead, Carrie.
One of the things that we've been working a lot on, and also with Brittany Peets from Mass Food System Collaboratives is farm to school work and food literacy. And Brittany, you might want to talk a little bit about this too. She was so instrumental in introducing a food literacy bill in Massachusetts. And so we have a farm to school team in Salem that I'm part of, but also several teachers and people from the wellness committee who've really been advocating to expand farm to school work in Salem and to get a position within the school for food system literacy. So we've been doing things like we just had a farm to school event at one of the school and invited the whole city and did things like, show off the garden, and we had food trucks where the food that was made from the school's farm to school program. And we had a number of organizations tabling, where we did have information on the food literacy bill, and we invited state legislators who came. So they were exposed to it without us doing it directly, asking for them to vote for it. And our state senator did end up co-sponsoring that bill. So, I mean, it was a great way to promote the work, but still staying within the parameters of our advocacy regulations.
I mean, I don't know how you can go wrong with food trucks and kids and gardens. Like, that sounds lovely. Brittany, did you want to add anything to the work that you're doing around farm to school literacy?
I think Carrie did a good summary, but yeah, I think it's like that event, kind of something that a lot of people can get on board with, and it's generally about educating rather than a specific angle, I guess.
We haven't. I'm Cassidy. I'm with Johnson County, Iowa Food Policy Council. We haven't really ran into issues of crossing this line from advocacy to lobbying, but I think one way that that helps us stay in line with like other potential issues we could run into being a county advisory board is we have a board of supervisors members serve as a liaison, and so sometimes he comes to every meetings, and sometimes he'll like voice concern if he thinks that like the county attorneys or the auditor's office will have like an issue with something we're proposing to do with our budget or something like that. So he kind of like serves as a check in those meetings, or a whole like let us know if he has pause about something we're pitching to do. Not like whether or not it aligns with what he views as the vision forward for the county, but more so like, hey, maybe you should talk to the county attorney's office about that, or I heard this from so-and-so, and maybe you should have a follow-up conversation to see if that's allowed.
That's great. It sounds like it's also a back and forth education where you all are talking about food systems and he's helping you with the process of knowing where to go to.
Definitely.
Thank you. Kristen?
Yeah, I was just going to echo a little bit of what Carrie said. Hi, Carrie. I reached out to Carrie not that long ago for a project that we were doing. So with our department, we have a Department of Health and Wellness that is embedded within the city of Kingston, New York. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we also only have 24,000 people. We are in New York's Hudson Valley, so we're pretty small. So it's kind of unique that we have this Department of Health and Wellness that addresses the social determinants of health, not like health inspections. And we've been doing I think a lot of passive education. The commission has been around for 5 years, I believe, at this point. And so there's a lot. We have a quarterly newsletter that we send to our local and state legislators. We invite them to our events. It doesn't mean that they come to all of them, but I think that's been helpful to increase their knowledge of the work that we do. So I think our big issue is not generally that people call us out for what probably is lobbying. It sounds like sometimes our biggest issue is more just that folks aren't paying attention a lot of times to what we're saying, and we want to get them invested in the idea of food systems change, that is a priority. That's something they should be thinking about and talking about. So we just do a lot of inviting folks, showing them cute kids doing things, sending out our newsletters, so that's a little bit of education. And we are developing a food system plan for the city of Kingston that it sounds like it'll align nicely with some other folks have recommended. This idea of getting an agenda for improving our food system that will then be adopted by our Common Council. We also have a bicycle and pedestrian master plan. So if anyone is curious about that we just completed, and it will go before our Common Council to be formally adopted as like a resolution that we will be achieving these goals. And we hope to do the same with a food system plan that will come out sometime next year. So yes, I think it's like the twofold. It's like kind of like casually inviting them, getting them interested in food stuff, and then getting something adopted as an official resolution for our local government.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. I think the education piece is a huge component of understanding that food systems is something that government has a role in and can support in many different ways, and cute kids.
Well, could I also add on to that? And Eileen, I would also draw you out again, but Geary County just published their food system plan, and it's an excellent plan, 10-year plan, county assessment, and the Food Policy Council drives that plan. And what I would say, I agree. So I forgot your name, but the speaker who was just on, because we don't necessarily have issues that we could point out other than the food sales tax that we talked about in Kansas. But Eileen, was there anything in that study that had to do with any lobbying? Like I was thinking the other day, we were talking about goal number 4, and it talked about fully funding the local ADA-bus system, which is, the local transportation for people. It's just, you schedule it through the county. So in that case, we batted around the words fully funded. So it said fully funded. So we're thinking, who funds it, and why would the Food Policy Council be able to affect a change there? So then when we talked to the ADA-bus guy, the director, he said, because the Food Policy Council could then communicate to local decision makers to fund that bus system fully. Hopefully that makes sense. It was not a dumb way to say it, but it was like, that was our contribution to get funding to the local free bus system. And so I think I would agree. We've been given that we have this 10-year plan that Eileen she was our excellent consultant on, but they signed it immediately accepted it, no questions, within the same meeting. So my point in that is, I feel like we have great support from local government, but if we found something on a state level or something that the Food Policy Council wanted to advocate for, we would always start with them to make sure they were on board with that, as a partner in that process. And I said earlier, I work for Kansas State University, and so we get so much training on, we aren't allowed to have an opinion and advocacy and what is, lobbying, that everything we do with the Food Policy Council is as an individual. So
Thank you, Anne. That's a really good point, that the limitations on advocacy and lobbying don't just stop with government, they're also through university, I think extension as well. Yeah. Are there other strategies, other actions, things that you have tried with your council to kind of circumvent some pushback or barriers?
Karen, I have one, but it's more of a pep talk than a strategy. And what we talk about a lot with our Kansas councils is that when it comes to advocacy and lobbying, you have all these organizations that you all are a part of, you're members of, farm bureaus, farmers unions, hunger relief organizations, and all those groups can do the advocacy and lobbying, but there is only one Food Policy Council. And that council has a specific role in terms of its connection to local government in our case. So I know it's super hard because you guys have these council members that are like really excited and want to do, want to shout it from the rooftops. But I think that's something that we try to bring it back to, is that there's a unique role that these food policy councils play, and it's important to kind of protect that. It's a special thing, not to sound too cheesy, but that, you know, that you are all part of this democracy and this chance to bring food systems into local government. And so if it feels controversial and it in your inner Jiminy Cricket is like, I don't know if we should do this, pass it on to one of the organizations you work with and let them run with it. Because food policy councils play a unique role, and you wouldn't want to jeopardize that, I guess.
Thanks, Eileen. It's helpful. Were there other questions that were coming up in your group where you were like, we're running into this issue, we don't know what to do, that you'd like to pose to the group and see if anyone else has had a similar situation?
I guess I don't want to like be an extreme talker here. It's probably too late, but anyway, so in our group, what we noticed is that so many people were new. Almost everybody said, I've only been here about a month, I've only done this about a month or something. So I think what Eileen just said is very vital, because sometimes when you aren't sure what to do because you're new, you want to do everything for everybody, you know, because you're going to save the world. But I think what Eileen said is right. You focus on your food policy, your food system plan. And then you'll know in 6 months, you'll know exactly where you need to be.
Thanks, Anne. I think we needed to put a caveat on the sign up that this isn't going to educate you about advocacy and lobbying fully, but I'm glad the new people are here too. I think it's a good conversation to be a part of. Cassidy put in the chat, curious if any county embedded councils have received permission to actually spend on lobbying. Sorry,
that was just not to spend on lobbying, but since we're in a space where there are councils who are embedded in county government, one thing we've wanted, there are lots of nuances to what we are and aren't allowed to do outside of just like the lobbying versus advocacy question. So we have explored the idea of compensating council members in a need-based way for just showing up to meetings and like being on the council. So I was just, if there are any examples, I thought this would be a good space to ask for that.
I just put it in the chat. I forget what year this was done. I want to say 2019, but our county changed it so that any volunteer non-county employee serving on a appointed county committee would get a $25 stipend for each of the required meetings for participation.
That's great. And what county are you? Where are you located out of again, Michael?
It's okay. It's Washtenaw County, Michigan.
Okay. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a lot, but it's a gesture.
Also, of note in that policy is you cannot decline it. And that has been a barrier for some people who did not want to be employed by the county. So it's, in a rare occasion, been a plus minus situation, I'd say.
thank you. So it looks like there's a couple of other comments in Rochester. They're compensated, but it's from funds from grants. And then in Allen County Grow, they do not receive compensation for serving on the policy council. And Eileen, you said in Sedgwick County, they were told they couldn't because they would have to compensate all advisory board members.
Yeah, Wichita has like 40 advisory boards. And so they were like, well, if we do it for one, we have to do it for all. And it kind of was their way of ending the conversation.
Great, thank you. Good question, Cassidy. Daryl, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. So I understand the limitations on lobbying for groups that are attached to the government. But if your group is not attached to the government and I believe it was 20% of the time is able to be spent on lobbying, how is that time calculated? Like, how does it how do you know when you've reached 21% or I'm only at 18%, so now I can continue to go a couple little longer? That's a question for Carrie or Eileen.
Also, I was just gonna jump into, I missed that earlier presentation, but this 20% threshold is for a specific tax filing that nonprofits do. It's called the 501H election, I think. And it allows nonprofits to spend more on lobbying and retain their 501c3 public charity status. If we're all kind of government based, that those rules wouldn't apply. But for us as like a food bank, we're a 501c3 nonprofit charity. And if we are wanting to spend a lot on lobbying, we would file that election. Most nonprofits use the insubstantial part test, and they're spending so little on lobbying. And what you're measuring is usually staff time. And that's what you're spending money on, right? You're not like, where else is the money going besides paying for someone's time? So if most nonprofits are just spending a tiny portion, like 1 or 2% of their annual budget on lobbying, most nonprofits don't go through the separate 501H election because it's not a substantial part of their expenditures. They're not spending enough money on it. So there's a lot of information on Boulder advocacy on this nuance for nonprofits for anyone who needs to know that.
Thank you. That's helpful. And we'll send out the link for Boulder advocacy along with the presentation and recording as well. It's a great reminder. Thanks, Eileen. We have just a few more minutes. Any final questions or any experiences that you want to share?
I will just jump in and say for us, we worked with our county maybe like 5-6 years ago to get much more clarity on what we were allowed to do and structure and all of that, and put together a guide. So if we're doing this, we need permission from this person, et cetera. County governments lobby, like they have a registered lobbyist. They are lobbying the state government. So it's not like counties can't lobby. They just restrict some of their committees to participating in that. So don't be dissuaded by thinking like, oh, that's not a thing that a county can do. It's like, no, I'm sure there's a registered lobbyist being paid to lobby on behalf of the county to the state elected officials. So just keep that in mind and figure out how you can use them.
Become their friends. Thank you. That's a really good point. Well, I wanted to say thank you to Carrie, Eileen, and Brittany for being a part of this and making this happen and bringing this question to us. And also thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon for this conversation.